Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
Hello, everybody. Today is the 5th of July, and you're watching episode number 178 of Give the People What They Want. Lots of very interesting stories. Today's show brought to you by People's Dispatch and Globetrotter. Also, we have with us Roger McKenzie of Morning Star. Roger, thanks once again. And a lot of stories. And of course, we're going to start with the bit of news which has really been dominating the internet, dominating Twitter all across the day. That is the election results from the United Kingdom, where, as anticipated, of course, the Labour Party won the elections. Keir Starmer said to be the next Prime Minister. But a lot of interesting things about that verdict, especially the vote share, the number of seats, some of the results which went in a completely different manner from what was expected. Roger, first of all, maybe take us through, let's go a bit deep into the story. I think it illustrates a lot about the world we're living in today. So take us through what's happened in the UK. It's not as it appears.
Well, thanks. I mean, rather than describing it as Labour winning the election, what I would say is that it's more like the Tories lost the election and lost massively, because when you look at the distribution of votes, it's really, really clear. There's really not that sort of enthusiasm for Labour. What there was a lot of enthusiasm to do was to get rid of the Conservative Party out of power. And with that, I think that meant that the votes were pretty distributed around. I mean, some of the results are really notable. Yesterday, of course, 4th of July was Independence Day in the US. Well, it was Independence Day in Britain because a lot of independence, and that might not sound a lot to other people, but actually in a British context, that is a lot. That's more than I can ever remember being elected in my lifetime as independents in a British general election. And one of the notable people elected there was the former leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. But actually all of the 5 independents were elected on a very, very strong pro-Palestinian ticket. And that included not just eating into votes of just any old MP. They actually managed to get rid of at least one Labour frontbencher, Jonathan Ashworth, but also just the whole way that the Palestine issue was absolutely front and centre on the vote, on the ballot. I think there are some other interesting aspects to this. I mean, obviously, Labour is going in with its biggest majority ever. I think probably the biggest majority of any party, 412 seats that they've won. But I think when you look at the votes, actually Labour got more votes, actual votes, last election, and that was portrayed as a landslide against Labour, as portrayed as Labour's worst ever election results and so on. But actually they got more votes last time. In fact, the time before that, in 2017, Labour got 12 million votes. And this time, Labour got 9 million votes and has a thumping majority. So there's real issues around the voting system in Britain, how you can get a third of the votes that are cast and yet end up with 2/3 of the seats in Parliament. I think there were some danger signs with the vote. I think the Reform Party, a really horribly, right-wing outfit, and I deliberately call them an outfit because they're actually registered as a company. They're not even it's not so what this actually means is that companies, I don't know, Amazon might decide to run candidates in the British general election. Well, there is a precedent set now that a company can run and can win seats. So I think there's some dangers about that, but also the vote of Labour in Scotland, they trounced the Scottish National Party, and frankly, without that vote, I think we'd be having a very different kind of conversation today about where Labour had ended up in the general election. Also across Wales, the Tories completely trounced. No Conservatives in Wales at all now. Labour strengthening that as a stronghold. From Northern Ireland, we have Sinn Féin now being the largest party for the first time, the largest party from Northern Ireland in Westminster, and this at a time when they're also the largest party in Stormont, that's the Northern Ireland Assembly, and also the largest party in local government across Northern Ireland. So I think there's some massive shifts that are taking place, and there'll be a lot of political scientists who'll do their stuff over the next few days. But for me, one of the big things here is that how a party can win a third of the votes and yet end up with 2/3 of all the seats that have been won in the parliament. That's not logical to anybody, I'm sure, but the careerists who sit there in the Labour Party who've now got jobs as MPs, they won't mind too much about that. They'll be happy that they're in government, but we'll see what they deliver. I think you'd be hard pressed to find anybody who's got a clue about what Labour's going to deliver for working class people. So the movement's already started to build some movement to make sure that Labour delivers on the few promises that it has actually bothered to make.
Well, definitely a triumph for the centre in Britain. But, just across the British Isle in France, there's a very different sort of race going down and different results predicted there. We saw last Sunday the first round of the French elections, and this Sunday will be the second round where the majority of seats are going to be decided in runoffs. Prasanth, tell us what's at stake in these elections in France.
Wait, sorry. Okay, my internet is a bit glitchy. Sorry, everyone, about that. But like Zoe, like you said, very different election in France, and in some ways, what is happening in France was widely predicted. People had been warning about it. The unions had been warning about it. The people's movements had been warning about it. But it's a direct result of the Emmanuel Macron government's policies over the past many years. What we have right now, the situation where the National Front is leading, emerged as a single leading force in the elections last week. Now, of course, France has a strange, not I wouldn't say strange system. It is an electoral system where it's held in 2 rounds. And after the first round, all candidates who have scored about 12.5% of the vote and above will contest in the second round. So usually that's just 2 candidates, but this time, because of the high voting percentage in the first round of the elections, in many constituencies, there are 3 candidates who are eligible to contest in the second round of elections. So there's been a spate of withdrawal of candidates in an attempt to build some kind of broader unity against the far-right National Front Party, which emerged as the single leading party in the elections last Sunday. So many candidates, both from the center, if you can call that the center. Emmanuel Macron is described as a centrist, but he's definitely a right-wing figure. So, both Macron's party as well as the New Popular Alliance, the broad left-wing alliance, the candidates who are third from both these formations have been withdrawing to give the other remaining candidate a better chance against the far-right party. Now, I think the key question, here is what happens in Sunday's election. A lot of predictions say the National Front may not reach the majority mark by itself, but will still try to form a government. But I think this is beyond just the numbers that we are seeing over here. It is also the fact that the National Front, a far-right organization, far right movement, which even 15, 20 years ago was considered a really fringe organization, has over time become a mainstream political party, such a powerful force. And a huge reason for that is the complete bankruptcy of forces in the center. The parties like, for instance, figures like Macron, who, despite getting a number of mandates, carried out a number of strong anti-worker policies, which actually drove some sections of the population towards the far right. And this has also been accompanied by a very strong demonization of the left, of the leftist forces across France. We've seen that, where solidarity with Palestine, like in Britain and other parts of Europe, solidarity with Palestine is seen as something that is anti-Semitic, and a very strong attempt to tarnish the French left. Interestingly, the French Left Alliance, which contested this election, has come out with a very powerful set of proposals. Some of them at least quite radical in terms of how they're trying to sort of fix some of the problems in French society. But there's been this overwhelming campaign against them in terms of branding them anti-Semitic, branding them the usual scaremongering tactics that are used against the left in many parts of the world, on full display in France as well. And all this together has led to a situation where, for the first time, the National Front seems, the National Rally seems very strongly, it seems to be in a very strong position to sort of form the government. So very difficult and scary situation for a lot of people in France at this point of time. And we'll have to wait and watch what the results are.
Definitely. Well, the French people, once again, heading to polls this Sunday. We will be following that election, as we have for the past couple of weeks, and see how the far right is responded to by the people of France. Just across the pond, as they say, this past week, many people have been talking about Biden's abysmal performance, of course, in the CNN debate last week. Headlines have been dominated really by this question of, will he drop out, will he won't? But another very important question regarding actual democracy in the country, besides these kind of raving lunatics that desire to occupy the White House, is the question of political prisoners in the United States. This is a question that is often weaponized by the US to attack other countries. But in fact, many people would know that in the United States, there are actually dozens of political prisoners, many whom were criminalized and persecuted for their role in national liberation struggles and the revolutionary movement of the 1960s and 70s. Many who have spent decades in prison, accused of all sorts of things. One of these political prisoners is Leonard Peltier. His name is known around the world just because of the injustice that he's faced at the hands of the US judiciary. He is the longest held political prisoner in the United States. He's been in prison for over 40 years. His health is declining. He was a leading activist in the American Indian movement in the 60s and accused of killing FBI agents in a very, very fraught case with many irregularities, which have been proven time and time again by activists to warrant a retrial, to warrant his immediate parole. There's so many reasons why his case is so unjust. And last month, on June 10th, he had his first parole hearing in over a decade. And this past Tuesday, it was announced that his parole was denied. This is essentially a death sentence for the, aging and ill political prisoner Leonard Peltier. It's a really tragic blow for the indigenous movement, for the movement to free political prisoners. And what's interesting to note is that actually Joe Biden has the power to free Leonard Peltier. He has complete power to actually say, spend the last years of your life with your family. This is what supporters have been demanding, again, for decades, that he just be allowed to live out the rest of his life with his community, with his family. And again, at the end of Obama's presidency, we know that there was a huge campaign calling on him to commute the sentence of Leonard Peltier. Even when Bill Clinton was in presidency, there was actually hopes that he would be, pardoned, given this presidential pardon, which often happens at the end of presidents' terms. This was blocked essentially by a mobilization of the FBI, who is hell-bent on keeping Leonard Peltier in prison to set an example. And again, this is just such a blight on what the US proclaims as the most democratic country in the world. There's, again, dozens of political prisoners who are withering away in prison on these life sentences, oftentimes accused of crimes they did not commit, but again, really just guilty of trying to fight for a future where people are not oppressed in the country, where they can have rights for all. So this latest news from the Leonard Peltier case is very devastating, but supporters are going to continue demanding that he be freed. All cases of when political prisoners have been released in the United States has not been because of the goodwill of one president or another, or because of the correct way that the legal system works. It has been a result of mass pressure by people's movements, and they're not going to let up with this latest setback. But it is, of course, an indictment really of how the US legal system works and who it works for. So with that, I think we're going to head once again back over to Asia, where for the past couple of days, leaders of Central Asia and East Asia have been meeting in Kazakhstan as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Heads of State Summit. We know that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin were present at this summit. Prasanth, if your internet holds up, tell us what's been happening over in Kazakhstan for the past couple of days.
Right. Very important summit taking place in Kazakhstan, Astana, a city with a long history of very important summits as well. We've covered some of that, but the SCO is actually emerging as one of the most important organizations in the world. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that, because despite the fact that there are the countries who are part of the SCO have often in some cases have very divergent interests. There are some cases of even rivalry, for instance. But nonetheless, the fact is that the SCO is a platform, so to speak, where these countries in Central and South Asia can come together and try to sort of chart a course for the region with minimal interference from the global policeman, that is the United States or its allies. And the SCO was one of those platforms which in recent times has come up as as offering that space to actually do that, and it has acquired more importance after the Ukraine war began, of course. But even without that, I think it's a very significant place, a very significant platform where I don't think the idea is that it's not an alliance. It's very important to understand that it's not a full-fledged alliance. Like I said, many of the countries, many sets of countries have slightly different agenda and perspective towards each other's, but it is a space where engagement is possible, and that itself is a great sign of hope for that region as well. Also, because if you look at the GDP of the countries who are part of the SCO, if you look at the population of the countries which are part of the SCO, that constitutes a substantial segment, that constitutes a huge part of where of the future, so to speak. So organizations like the SCO in some senses are different from organizations of the past, like the G7 or an organization like NATO, for instance, which had where clearly the client relationship between the United States and its allies was on full display, which were essentially groups of colonial powers trying to sort of continue their hegemony, exert their power across the world. So the SCO is in that way a very different organization. So of course the standout moment was Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin meeting once again, indicating that their partnership is very strong. And of course there's going to be more meetings. In fact, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi was not there at the summit, but he is going to go to Russia in a couple of days, I think after 5 years, which is going to really annoy people in the United States, definitely. So, and of course, there's a question of Afghanistan as well, where the SCO is playing a very central role. SCO member countries are playing a very central role in trying to untangle the mess which the United States created for years, in fact, for close to 2 decades. So all of these are very key agenda items at the SCO. Of course, beyond the diplomatic discussions, beyond the meetings, one-on-one meetings, I think what we need to see is the process that is taking place here, which every year with every meeting, the kind of the possible strengthening of the platform, the fact that the platform is moving forward itself is, I think, a very important thing to watch out for.
Well, of course, the U.S. is paying attention to this and calculating its moves. Interesting to note, for all of those who have read the Tricon dossier, Hyperimperialism, this dossier speaks about exactly the U.S. attempt to really counter a lot of these initiatives that are emerging from the global South, and highlights just the vast infrastructure the United States has at its disposal in terms of the military infrastructure, in terms of military spending. The U.S. is by far the largest military spender in the entire world. And this past week, we've actually seen some of this on display in 3 different locations with 3 different commands. The U.S. is apparently trying to send a message to the world just how strong it is and just how well trained and ready it is to actually take some of its threats seriously regarding, East Asia, regarding these, as you said, not alliances that are forming, but even just forms of cooperation in the global South. And we saw this past weekend 3 different military exercises, all taking place in the Pacific. So many people would know that for the next couple of weeks, RIMPAC is taking place in the Pacific, being launched off of Hawaii, which is, again, an occupied and colonized territory by the United States. It has some of the largest U.S. military bases, and dozens of nations are going to be participating in this Pacific Rim military exercises. So that's on one hand. Then we have, of course, Freedom Edge, which is taking place. It was taking place this past weekend, a joint military exercise between South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. And then we also had another military exercise in the Pacific, which was called Southern Seas 2024. This is actually run by the U.S. Southern Command. So we've had CENTCOM, SOUTHCOM, and INDOPAC all carrying out different exercises, and not alone. Important to note that, again, the Freedom Edge was a tripartite military exercise. Japan and South Korea, the Republic of Korea. RIMPAC, again, has participation of dozens of nations, including Brazil, Colombia, the Philippines, other countries. The Southern Seas exercise, it was happening both in Colombia, but it's essentially sort of a military tour of the Southcom led by Laura Richardson. So there's going to be engagement with Colombia, there's engagement with Brazil, Ecuador, a lot of countries of South America. And it's important that we actually pay attention to these moves because, again, they're not happening in a vacuum. The meeting in Kazakhstan is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in a moment where, again, the U.S. is gradually increasing the pressure on all of these flashpoints. We know that the Pacific is a huge flashpoint because of the U.S.'s growing and intensifying Cold War on China. Again, the Korean Peninsula continues to be one of the most important points of this growing pressure campaign. In August, these military drills are going to escalate with Republic of Korea. So it's very important that we keep our eyes on this. We keep our eyes on all of these different U.S. Army commands. They are the most, deliberate expression of U.S. power. And again, the U.S. is suffering an important defeat in the realm of public opinion when it's regards to Israel and Palestine. But Israel is not its only imperialist interest, and it is, of course, has its eyes on China. We know this. It has been announced. The pivot to Asia, Obama announced it, and The U.S. has been continuing on this. So again, as journalists, very important to keep our eyes on these military exercises. They're not just exercises, they're also a show of power and a blueprint for how it wants to be moving in the coming years. So with that, we'll head to another area that's been a major flashpoint over the couple of weeks. Roger, give us the latest on Kenya and what's been happening with the protests there.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, really, how this expression of US power reaches over to Kenya as well. I mean, just yards up the road from the White House are the offices of the World Bank and the IMF, and that's what's really behind what's going on in Kenya. The way that those financial institutions are trying to put the squeeze on in Kenya, and the way the president, William Ruto, and his people in the parliament are really trying to do their bidding, really, and to do that. They're trying to put up taxes. They're trying to make life even more difficult for the people of Kenya. What we saw earlier on this week was more protests by the people who are still protesting this finance bill that's going through Parliament. Ruto has got until next week to sign this bill. But the people are putting the pressure on to say, don't sign it. We need to be able to survive. You know, I was in Nairobi at the end of last year, and one of the things that I saw there was just how difficult it is for people to survive. More than, I think it's about 90% of the economy there is in the informal, and that's just really difficult. So that's people just hawking on the street, you know, trying to make a living the best way that they can, and still having to pay taxes. And that really kind of surprised me, that people who are really kind of working for in the best way that they can, just to keep a roof over their own heads and a roof over the families' heads and to put bread on the table, were still expected to pay sky high taxes. Well, this piece of legislation would make it even more difficult for people to survive. So people have reached a tipping point and are just saying, we cannot do this anymore. And they've hit the streets to make that point. Now, of course, they've been met with a severe clampdown and the usual nonsense that the government comes out with by saying, oh, it's outside agitators coming in and causing trouble, when actually it's the people who are saying, we cannot do this anymore. And they, whatever little trust they had in William Ruto has been lost. I don't think they had very much in the first place, to be honest, but what little they have has gone. And they're saying to him, not just don't sign this bill because it will make our lives even harder than it already is. What they're also saying is it's time for you to go. The Communist Party of Kenya has labelled him as a tyrant. They said that they support these protests to get rid of the tyrant because he's just doing somebody else's bidding. And they're saying it's time he listened to the people of Kenya. So next week's going to be a flashpoint. If Ruto signs this bill, pretty well guaranteed there's going to be more protests in the street. But frankly, I think there'll be more protests to put the pressure on Ruto not to sign the bill. People just want change. People want to be able to survive. People want to be able to care for their families. It's very basic stuff that people just want to be able to just get by. They're not even asking for luxuries or anything like that. So I think, again, as reporters, our job is to keep an eye on what's going on and report what we see, because the corporate media certainly won't be covering this properly. And I think that's where our job comes in, to make sure that the truth is being told.
Thank you so much, Roger. It's a very important story to watch. And again, already over 10 people have been killed in this repression. This is not a protest that people are taking lightly. They're really fighting for their lives and they're fighting for their future. So extremely important story there in Kenya. That is all we have for you today. We're going to be following the French election this weekend and all the other key stories to bring you the latest next Friday. So make sure to tune in next Friday, give the people what they want. Follow our work at peoplesdispatch.org and on all social media platforms. We are now back into our Instagram account, so you can follow us there. Follow Roger's work at Morningstar Daily. Very important stuff there. We're definitely going to be following along to hear more commentary about these past parliamentary elections. Important to stay on there. And we will see you next week. Thanks so much for joining us.